Hi there, folks. I'm B. David Sloan, and this is episode 1 of Sinclair Lewis's novel, It Can't Happen Here. Sinclair Lewis is the first American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and the book is written in 1935 during the rise of fascism in Europe. The book follows small-time Vermont newspaper editor Dreamus Jessup as he watches the rise of one Berzelius Windrip, a populist candidate for president who turns the United States into a fascist dictatorship. Using a platform of pro-business nationalism and racism, Windrip wins his way to the White House, and it only gets worse from there. Lewis's novel uses several real politicians, preachers, and journalists of the day in order to answer the question, what if it happened here, and how might it? Each episode will include 5 minutes of discussion of the previous episode, as well as some questions for further discussion, and about 30 to 40 minutes of the text itself, expertly read, of course, by me, B. David Sloan. And without further ado, I present episode 1 of Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. As usual, like, subscribe, and share. It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 1. The handsome dining room of the Hotel Wessex, with its gilded plaster shields and the mural depicting the Green Mountains, had been reserved for the ladies' night dinner of the Fort Beulah Rotary Club. Here in Vermont, the affair was not so picturesque as it might have been on the western prairies. Oh, it had its points. There was a skit in which Madary Cole, gristmill and feed store, and Louis Rottenstern, custom tailoring, pressing, and cleaning, announced that they were those historic Vermonters, Brigham Young and Joseph Smith, and with their jokes about imaginary plural wives, they got in ever so many funny digs at the ladies present. But the occasion was essentially serious. All of America was serious now, after the 7 years of depression since 1929. It was just long enough after the Great War of 1914 to 1918 for the young people who had been born in 1917 to be ready to go to college or to another war, almost any old war that might be handy. The features of this night among the Rotarians were nothing funny, at least not obviously funny, for they were the patriotic addresses of Brigadier General Herbert Y. Edgeways, USA, retired, who dealt angrily with the topic peace through defense, millions for arms but not 1 cent for tribute, and of Miss Adelaide Tarr Gimmich, she who was no more renowned for her gallant anti-suffrage campaigning way back in 1919 than she was for having, during the Great War, kept the American soldiers entirely out of French cafes by the clever trick of sending them 10,000 sets of dominoes. Nor could any socially minded patriot sneeze at her recent, somewhat unappreciated efforts to maintain the purity of the American home by borrowing from the motion picture industry all persons, actors or directors or cameramen who had A. ever been divorced, B. been born in any foreign country, except Great Britain, since Miss Gimmich thought very highly of Queen Mary, or C. declined to take an oath to revere the flag, the Constitution, the Bible, and all other peculiarly American institutions. The annual ladies' dinner was a most respectable gathering, the flower of Fort Beulah. Most of the ladies and more than half of the gentlemen wore evening clothes, and it was rumored that before the feast, the inner circle had had cocktails privily served in room 289 of the hotel. The tables, arranged on 3 sides of a hollow square, were bright with candles, cut glass dishes of candy and slightly tough almonds, figurines of Mickey Mouse, brass rotary wheels, and small silk American flags stuck in gilded hard-boiled eggs. On the wall was a banner lettered, Service Before Self, and the menu, the celery, cream of tomato soup, broiled haddock, chicken croquettes, peas, and tutti-frutti ice cream, was up to the highest standards of the Hotel Wessex. They were all listening agape as General Edgeways was completing his manly yet mystical rhapsody on nationalism. For these United States alone among the greatest powers have no desire for foreign conquest. Our highest ambition is to be darned well let alone. Our only genuine relationship to Europe is in our arduous task of having to try to educate the crass and ignorant masses that Europe has wished upon us, up to something like the semblance of an American culture and good manners. But as I explained to you, we must be prepared to defend our shores against all alien gangs of international racketeers that call themselves governments, and that with such feverish envy are always eyeing our inexhaustible mines, our towering forests, our titanic and luxurious cities, our fair and far-flung fields. For the first time in all history, a great nation must go on arming itself more and more, not for conquest, not for jealousy, not for war, but for peace. Pray God it may never be necessary, but if foreign nations don't sharply heed our warning, there will, as when the proverbial dragon's teeth were sowed, spring up an armed and fearless warrior upon every square foot of these United States, so arduously cultivated and defended by pioneering fathers, whose sword-girded images we must be, or we shall perish. The applause was cyclonic. Professor Emil Staubmeier, the superintendent of schools, popped up to scream, "3 cheers for the general! Hip, hip, hooray!" All the audience made their faces to shine upon the general and Mr. Staubmeier, all save a couple of crank pacifist women and one Doremus Jessup, editor of the Fort Beulah Daily Informer, locally considered a pretty smart fellow, but kind of a cynic, who whispered to his friend, the Reverend Mr. Falk, "Our pioneer fathers did a rather skimpy job in arduously cultivating some of the square feet in Arizona." The culminating glory of the dinner was the address of Miss Adelaide Todd Gimmich, known throughout the country as the Uncie's Girl, because during the Great War she had advocated calling our boys in the AEF the Unkies. She hadn't merely given them dominoes. Indeed, her first motion had been far more imaginative. She wanted to send to every soldier on the front a canary in a cage. Think what it would have meant to them in the way of companionship and inducing memories of home and mother. A dear little canary, and who knows, maybe you could train him to hunt cooties. Seething with the notion, she got herself clear into the office of the quartermaster general, but that stuffy, machine-minded official refused her, or really refused the poor lad so lonely there in the mud, muttering in a cowardly way about some foolishness about the lack of transport for canaries. It is said that her eyes flashed real fire and that she faced the Jack in office like Joan of Arc with eyeglasses while she gave him a piece of her mind that he never forgot. In those good days, women really had a chance. They were encouraged to send their men folks or anybody else's men folks off to war. Mrs. Gimmich addressed every soldier she met, and she saw too that she met any of them who ventured within 2 blocks of her, as "my own dear boy." It is fabled that she thus saluted a colonel of Marines who'd come up from the ranks and who answered, "We own dear boys are certainly getting a lot of mothers these days. Personally, I'd rather have a few more mistresses." And the fable continues that she did not stop her remarks on the occasion except to cough for 1 hour and 17 minutes by the colonel's wristwatch. But her social services were not all confined to prehistoric areas. It was as recently as 1935 that she had taken up purifying the films, and before that she had first advocated and then fought prohibition. She had also, since the vote had been forced on her, been a Republican committee woman in 1932 and sent to President Hoover daily a lengthy telegram of advice. And though herself unfortunately childless, she was esteemed as a lecturer and a writer about child culture, and she was the author of a volume of nursery lyrics, including the immortal couplet, "All of the roundies are resting in rows, with roundy roundies around their toes." But always, 1917 or 1936, she was a raging member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. The DAR reflected the cynic Doremus Jessup that evening, is a somewhat confusing organization, as confusing as Theosophy or Relativity or the Hindu vanishing boy trick, all 3 of which it resembles. It is composed of females who spend 1/2 their waking hours boasting of being descended from the seditious American colonists of 1776, and the other and more ardent half in attacking all contemporaries who believe in precisely the principles for which those ancestors struggled. The DAR, reflected Doremus, has become as sacrosanct, as beyond criticism as even the Catholic Church or the Salvation Army. And there is this to be said, it has provided hearty and innocent laughter for the judicious, since it has contrived to be just as ridiculous as the unhappily defunct Ku Klux Klan, without any need of wearing, like the KKK, high dunces caps and public nightshirts. So whether Mrs. Adelaide Tarr-Gimmich was called in to inspire military morale or to persuade Lithuanian choral societies to begin their program with Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, always she was a DAR, and you could tell it as you listened to her with the Fort Beulah Rotarians on this happy May evening. She was short, plump, and pert of nose. Her luxuriant gray hair, she was 60 now, just the age of the sarcastic editor, Doremus Jessup, could be seen below her youthful, floppy leghorn hat. She wore a silk print dress with an enormous string of crystal beads, and pinned above her right bosom was an orchid among lilies of the valley. She was full of friendliness toward all the men present. She wriggled at them, she cuddled at them, as in a voice full of flute sounds and chocolate sauce she poured out her oration on how you boys can help us girls. Women, she pointed out, had done nothing with the vote. If the United States had only listened to her back in 1919, she could have saved them all this trouble. No, certainly not. No votes. In fact, women must resume her place in the home, and as the great author and scientist Mr. Arthur Brisbane had pointed out, what every woman ought to do is to have 6 children. At this second there was a shocking and appalling interruption. One Lorinda Pike, widow of a notorious Unitarian preacher, was the manager of a country super boarding house that called itself the Beulah Valley Tavern. She was a deceptively Madonna-like youngish woman with calm eyes, smooth chestnut hair parted in the middle, and a soft voice often colored with laughter. But on a public platform her voice became brassy, her eyes filled with embarrassing fury. She was the village scold, the village crank. She was constantly poking into things that were none of her business, and at town meetings she criticized every substantial interest in the whole country. The electric company's rates, the salaries of the school teachers, the ministerial association's high-minded censorship of books for the public library. Now, at this moment, when everything should have all been service and sunshine, Mrs. Lorinda Pike cracked the spell by jeering, "3 cheers for Brisbane! But what if a poor girl can't hook a man, have her 6 kids out of wedlock?" Then the good old warhorse Gimmich veteran of 100 campaigns against subversive Reds, trained to ridicule out of existence the cant of socialist hecklers and to turn the laughs against them, swung into gallant action. "My dear good woman, if a gal, as you call it, has any real charm and womanliness, she won't have to hook a man. She'll find him lined up 10 deep on her doorstep." Laughter and applause. The lady hoodlum had merely stirred Mrs. Gimmich into a noble passion. She did not cuddle at them now. She tore into it. "I tell you, my friends, the trouble with this whole country is that so many are selfish. There's 120 million people, with 95% of them only thinking of self, instead of turning to and helping the responsible businessmen to bring back prosperity. All these corrupt and self-seeking labor unions, money grubbers, thinking only of how much wages they can extort out of their unfortunate employers, with all the responsibilities they have to bear. What this country needs is discipline. Peace is a great dream, but maybe sometimes it's only a pipe dream. I'm not so sure. Now, this will shock you, but I want you to listen to one woman who will tell you the unadulterated hard truth instead of a lot of sentimental taffy. And I'm not sure, but that we need to be in a real war again in order to learn discipline. We don't want all this highbrow intellectuality, all this book learning. That's good enough in its way, but isn't it, after all, just a nice toy for grown-ups? No, what we need, all of us, what we must have, if this great land is going to go on maintaining its high position among the Congress of Nations, is discipline, willpower, character." She turned prettily then toward General Edgeways and laughed. "You've been telling us how to secure peace, but come on now, General, just among us Rotarians and Rotarians, fess up. With your great experience, don't you honest, cross your heart think that perhaps, just maybe, when a country has gone money mad like all our labor unions and workmen, with their propaganda to hoist income taxes that the thrifty and industrious have to pay for their shiftless ne'er-do-wells, then maybe to save their lazy souls and get some iron into them, a war might be a good thing? Come on now, tell your real middle name, Mong, General." Dramatically she sat down, and the sound of clapping filled the room like a cloud of downy feathers. The crowd bellowed, "Come on, General, stand up!" and "She's called your bluff, what you got?" or just a tolerant "Attaboy, Jen!" The General was short and globular, and his red face was smooth as a baby's bottom and adorned with white gold-framed spectacles. But he had the military snort and a virile chuckle. "Well, sir," he guffawed, on his feet, shaking a chummy forefinger at Mrs. Gimmich, "since you folks are bound and determined to drag the secrets out of a poor soldier, I better confess that while I do abhor war, yet there are worse things. My friends, far worse, a state of so-called peace in which labor organizations are riddled as by plague germs with insane notions out of an anarchist Red Russia. A state in which college professors, newspapermen, and notorious authors are secretly promulgating these same seditious attacks on the grand old Constitution. A state in which, as a result of being fed with these mental drugs, the people are flabby, cowardly, grasping, and lacking in the fierce pride of the warrior. No, such a state is far worse than war at its most monstrous." I guess maybe some of the things I said in my former speech were kind of a little bit obvious in what we used to call old hat when my brigade was quartered in England, about the United States only wanting peace and freedom from all foreign entanglements. No, what I'd really like us to do would be to come out and tell the whole world, "Now you boys never mind about the moral side of this. We have power, and power is its own excuse. I don't altogether admire everything Germany and Italy have done, but you've got to hand it to them. They've been honest enough and realistic enough to say to the other nations, just tend to your own business, will you? We've got strength and will, and for whomever has these divine qualities, it's not only a right, it's a duty to use them. Nobody in God's world ever loved a weakling, including that weakling himself. And I've got good news for you. This gospel of clean and aggressive strength is spreading everywhere in this country among the finest type of youth. Why, today, in 1936, there's less than 7% of collegiate institutions that do not have military training units under discipline as rigorous as the Nazis, and where once it was forced upon them by the authorities, now it is the strong young men and women who themselves demand the right to be trained in warlike virtues and skill, for mark you, the girls, with their instruction in nursing and the manufacture of gas masks and the like, are becoming every whit as zealous as their brothers. And all the really thinking type of professors are right there with them. Why, here as recently as 3 years ago, a sickeningly big percentage of students were blatant pacifists, wanting to knife their own native land in the dark. But now, when the shameless fools and advocates of communism tried to hold pacifist meetings, why, my friends, in the past 5 months, since January 1st, no less than 76 such exhibitionist orgies have been raided by their fellow students, and no less than 59 disloyal Red students have received their just deserts by being beaten up so severely that never again will they raise in this free country the blood-stained banner of anarchism. That, my friends, is news. As the general sat down amid ecstasies of applause, the village troublemaker, Mrs. Lorinda Pike, leapt up again and interrupted the love fest. "Look here, Mr. Edgeways, if you think you can get away with this sadistic nonsense without—" She got no farther. Francis Tasbro, the quarry owner and the most substantial industrialist in Fort Beulah, stood grandly up, quieted Lorinda with an outstretched arm, and rumbled in his Jerusalem the golden basso. "A moment, please, my dear lady. All of us here locally have got used to your political principles, but as Chairman, it is my unfortunate duty to remind you that General Edgeways and Mrs. Gimmich have been invited by the club to address us, whereas you, if you will excuse me saying so, are not even related to any Rotarian, but merely here as the guest of the Reverend Fount, than whom there is no one whom we more honor. So, if you will be so good... I thank you, madam. Lorinda Pike had slumped down into her chair with her fuse still burning. Mr. Francis Tasborough did not slump. He sat like the Archbishop of Canterbury on the archiepiscopal throne, and Doremus Jessup popped up to soothe them all. Being an intimate of Lorinda, and having since milkiest boyhood chummed up and detested Francis Tasborough, this Doremus Jessup, publisher of the Daily Informer, for all that he was a competent businessman and writer of editorials not without wit and good New England earthiness, was yet considered the prime eccentric of Fort Beulah. He was on the school board, the library board, and he introduced people like Oswald Garrison Villard, Norman Thomas, and Admiral Byrd when they came to town lecturing. Jessup was a littleish man, skinny, smiling, well-tanned, with a small gray mustache, a small and well-trimmed gray beard, in a community where to sport a beard was to confess oneself a farmer, a Civil War veteran, or a Seventh-day Adventist. Doremus's detractors said that he maintained the beard just to be highbrow and different, to try to appear artistic. Possibly they were right. Anyway, he skipped up now and murmured, "Well, all the birdies in their nest agree, my friend Mrs. Pike ought to know that freedom of speech becomes mere license when it goes so far as to criticize the army, differ with the DAR, and advocate the rights of the mob. So, Lorinda, I think you ought to apologize to the general, to whom we should be grateful for explaining to us what the ruling classes of the country really want. Come on now, my friend, jump up and make your excuses." He was looking down on Lorinda with sternness, yet Madary Cole, president of the Rotary, wondered if Doremus wasn't kidding them. He had been known to. Yes, no, he must be wrong, for Mrs. Lorinda Pike was, without rising, caroling, "Oh, yes, I do apologize, General. Thank you for your revelatory speech." The General raised his plump hand, and with a Masonic ring as well as a West Point ring on the sausage-shaped fingers, he bowed like Galahad or a head waiter. He shouted with parade-ground maleness, not at all, madam, not at all. We old campaigners never mind a healthy scrap. Glad when anybody interested in our fool ideas to go and get sore at us." And everybody laughed and sweetness reigned. The program wound up with Louis Rottenstern singing of a group of patriotic ditties, marching through Georgia and tenting on the old campground, and Dixie and Old Black Joe and "I only a poor cowboy and I know I done wrong." Louis Rottenstern was by all Fort Beulah classed as a good fellow, a caste just below that of real old-fashioned gentlemen. Doremus Jessup liked to go fishing with him and partridge hunting, and he considered that no Fifth Avenue tailor could do anything tastier in the way of a seersucker outfit. But Louis was a jingo. He explained, and rather often, that it was not he nor his father who had been born in the ghetto in Prussian Poland, but his grandfather, whose name Doremus suspected had been something less stylish and Nordic than Rottenstern. Louis's pocket heroes were Calvin Coolidge, Leonard Wood, Dwight L. Moody, and Admiral Lewis, who himself had been born in Flatbush, Long Island. He was not only 100% American, he exacted 40% of chauvinistic interest on top of the principle. He was on every occasion heard to say, "We ought to keep these foreigners out of the country, and what I mean, the kikes just as much as the wops and the hunkies and the chinks." Louis was altogether convinced that if the ignorant politicians would keep their dirty hands off banking and the stock exchange and hours of labor for salesmen and department stores, then everyone in the country would profit as beneficiaries of increased business, and all of them, including the retail clerks, would be rich as Aga Khan. So Louis put into his melodies not only his burning voice of a bidgoshed cantor, but all his nationalistic fervor, so that everyone joined in the choruses, particularly Mrs. Adelaide Tarr Gimmich, with her celebrated train caller's contralto. The dinner broke up in cataract-like sounds of happy adieu, and Doremus Jessup muttered to his good wife Emma, a solid, kindly, worried soul who liked knitting, solitaire, and the novels of Kathleen Norris. "Was I terrible in butting in that way?" "Oh no, Dormouse. You did just right. I'm fond of Lorinda Pike, but why does she have to show off and parade all her silly socialist ideas?" "You old Tory," said Doremus. "Don't you want to invite the Siamese elephant, the Gimmich, to drop in and have a drink?" "I do not," said Emma Jessup. And in the end, when the Rotarians shuffled and built themselves and their innumerable motor cars, it was Frank Tasbro who invited the choicer males, including Doremus, home for an after-party. End of Chapter 1. It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, Chapter 2. As he took his wife home and drove up Pleasant Hill to Tasbro's, Doremus Jessup meditated upon the epidemic patriotism of General Edgeways, but he broke it off to let himself be absorbed in the hills, as it has been his habit for the 53 years out of his 60 years of life that he had spent in Fort Beulah, Vermont. Legally a city, Fort Beulah was a comfortable village of old red brick, old granite workshops, and houses of white clapboards or gray shingles, with a few smug little modern bungalows, yellow or steel brown. There was but little manufacturing, a small woolen mill, a sash and door factory, a pump works. The granite, which was its chief produce, came from the quarries 4 miles away, and in Fort Beulah itself were only the offices, all the money, and the meager shacks of most of the quarry workers. It was a town of perhaps 10,000 souls inhabiting about 20,000 bodies. The proportion of soul possession may be too high. There was but one comparative skyscraper in town, the 6-story Tasbro building, with the offices of Tasbro and Scarlet Granite Quarries, the offices of Doremus' son-in-law, Fowler Greenhill, M.D., and his partner, old Dr. Olmsted, of lawyer Mungo Kitterick, of Harry Kinderman, agent for maple syrup and dairying supplies, and of 30 or 40 other village samurai. It was a downy town, a drowsy town, a town of security and tradition, which still believed in Thanksgiving, 4th of July, Memorial Day, and to which May Day was not an occasion for labor parades, but for distributing small baskets of flowers. It was a May night, late in May 1936, with a 3/4 moon. Doremus' house was a mile from the business center of Fort Beulah on Pleasant Hill, which was a spur thrust like a reaching hand out from the dark rearing mass of Mount Terror. Upland, meadows, moon glistening, he could see among the wildernesses of spruce and maple and poplar on the ridges far above him. And below, as his car climbed, was Ethan Creek, flowing through the meadows. Deep woods rearing mountain bulwarks, the air like spring water, serene clapboard houses that remembered the War of 1812 and the boyhoods of those errant Vermonters, Stephen A. Douglas, the Little Giant, and Hiram Powers and Thaddeus Stevens and Brigham Young and President Chester Alan Arthur. No, Powers and Arthur, they were weak sisters, pondered Doremus, but Douglas and Tad Stevens and Brigham, the old stallion, I wonder if we're breeding up any paladins like those stout, grouchy old devils. If we're producing them anywhere in New England, anywhere in America, anywhere in the world. They had guts, independence, did what they wanted to, and thought what they liked. And everybody could go to hell. The youngsters today, the aviators have plenty of nerve. The physicists, these 25-year-old PhDs that violate the inviolable atom, they're pioneers, but most of the wishy-washy young people today, going 70 miles an hour but not going anywhere, not enough imagination to want to go anywhere, getting their music by turning a dial, getting their phrases from the comic strips instead of from Shakespeare and the Bible and Veblen and old Bill Sumner, pap-fed flabs, like this smug pup Malcolm Tasbro, hanging around Sissy. Wouldn't it be hell if that stuffed shirt Edgeways and that political Mae West Gimmich were right, and we need all these military monkey shines and maybe a full war to conquer some sticky hot country we don't want on a bet, to put some starch and git into these marionettes that we call our children. But rats, these hills, castle walls, and this air, they can keep their Cotswolds and Harz Mountains and Rockies. G. Jessup, topographical patriot, and I am a Dormouse. Would you mind driving in the right-hand side of the road, on curves anyway? Said his wife peaceably. An upland hollow and mist beneath the moon, a veil of mist over apple blossoms, and the heavy bloom of an ancient lilac bush beside the ruin of a farmhouse burned these 60 years and more. Mr. Francis Tasbro was the president, general manager, and chief owner of the Tasbro and Scarlet Granite Quarries at West Beulah, 4 miles from the fort. He was rich, persuasive, and he had constant labor troubles. He lived in a new on Pleasant Hill, a little beyond Doremus Jessup's, and in that house he maintained a private barroom luxurious as that of a motor company's advertising manager at Grosse Pointe. And Frank Tasbro himself boasted that, though his family had for 6 generations lived in New England, he was no tight Yankee, but in his efficiency, his salesmanship, the complete Pan-American business executive. He was a tall man, Tasbro, with a yellow mustache and a monotonously emphatic voice. He was 54, 6 years younger than Doremus Jessup, and when he had been 4, Doremus had protected him from the results of his singularly unpopular habit of hitting the other small boys over the head with things, all kinds of things, sticks and toy wagons and lunchboxes and dry cow flops. Assembled in his private barroom tonight after the Rotarian dinner were Frank himself, Doremus Jessup, Medary Cole, the miller, Superintendent of Schools Emil Stobmeyer, R.C. Crowley, Roscoe Conklin Crowley, the weightiest banker in Fort Beulah, and, rather surprisingly, Tasbro's pastor, the Episcopal minister, the Reverend Mr. Fouke. His old hands, as delicate as porcelain, his wilderness of hair, silk soft and white, his unfleshly face betokening the good life. Mr. Fouke had come from a solid Knickenbocker family, and he had studied in Edinburgh and Oxford, along with the General Theological Seminary. And in all of the Beulah Valley there was, aside from Doremus, no one who more contentedly hid away in the shelter of the hills. The barroom had been professionally interior decorated by a young New York gentleman with the habit of standing with the back of his right hand against his hip. It had a stainless steel bar, framed illustrations from La Vie Parisienne, silvered metal tables, and chromium-plated aluminum chairs with scarlet leather cushions. All of them except Tasbro, Medary Cole, a social climber, on whom the favors of Frank Tasbro were as honey and fresh ripened figs, and Professor Emil Stobmeyer, were uncomfortable in this parrot cage elegance, but none of them, including Mr. Fouke, seemed to dislike Frank's soda and excellent scotch or the sardine sandwiches. And I wonder if Tad Stevens would have liked this either, considered Doremus. He'd have snarled, old cornered catamount, but probably not at the whiskey. Doremus, demanded Tasbro, why don't you take a tumble to yourself? All these years you've had a lot of fun criticizing, always being agin the governments, kidding everybody, posing as such a liberal that you'll stand for all these subversive elements. Time for you to quit playing tag with these crazy ideas and come in and join the family. These are serious times. Maybe 28 million on relief and beginning to get ugly, thinking they've got a vested right now to be supported. And the Jew communists and the Jew financiers plotting together to control the country. I can understand how, as a young fellow, you could pump up a little sympathy for the unions and even for the Jews, though, as you know, I'll never get over being sore at you for taking the side of the strikers when those thugs were trying to ruin my whole business. Why, you were even friendly with that alien murderer, Carl Pascal, who started the whole strike. Maybe I didn't enjoy firing him when it was all over. But anyway, these labor racketeers are getting together now with communist leaders and determined to run the country, to tell men like me how to run our business. And just like General Edgway said, they'll refuse to serve their country if you just happen to get dragged into some war. Yes, sir, a mighty serious hour, and it's time for you to cut the cackle and join the really irresponsible citizens. Yes, I agree it's a serious time, said Doremus. With all the discontent there is in this country to wash him into office, Senator Winthrop has got an excellent chance to be elected president next November. And if he is, probably his gang of buzzards will get us into some war, just to grease their insane vanity and show the world we're the huskiest nation going. And then I, the liberal, and you, the plutocrat, and the bogus Tory over there will be let out and shot at 3 a.m. Pretty serious, huh? Rats, you're exaggerating, said R.C. Crowley. Doremus went on. If Bishop Prang, or Savonarola in the Cadillac 16, swings his radio audience and his League of Forgotten Men to Buzz Winthrop, Buzz will win. People will think they're electing him to create more economic security. Then watch the terror. God knows there's been enough indication that we can have tyranny in America. The fix of the southern sharecroppers, the working conditions of the miners and the garment makers, and our keeping Mooney in prison for so many years. But wait till Winthrop shows us how to say it with a machine gun. Democracy, here and in Britain and France, it hasn't been so universal as sniveling slavery as Nazism in Germany, such an imagination-hating Pharisaic materialism as Russia, even if it has produced industrialists like you, Frank, and bankers like you, R.C., and given you altogether too much power and money. On the whole, with scandalous exceptions, democracy's given the ordinary worker more dignity than he's ever had. That may be menaced now by Winthrop, all the Winthrops. All right, maybe we'll have to fight paternal dictatorship with a little sound patricide, fight machine guns with machine guns. Wait till Buzz takes charge of us. A real fascist dictatorship. Nonsense, nonsense, snorted Tasbro. That couldn't happen here in America. Not possibly. We're a country of freemen. The answer to that, suggested Doremus Jessup, if Mr. Falk will forgive me, is the hell it can't. Why, there's no country in the world that can't get more hysterical, yes, or more obsequious than America. Look how Huey Long became absolute monarch over Louisiana, and how the Right Honorable Mr. Senator Berzelius Winthrop owns his state. Listen to Bishop Prang and Father Coughlin on the radio, divine oracles to millions. Remember how casually most Americans have accepted Tammany grafting and Chicago gangs and the crookedness of so many President Harding's appointees. Could Hitler's bunch or Winthrop's be worse? Remember the Ku Klux Klan? Remember our war hysteria when we called sauerkraut Liberty cabbage and somebody actually proposed calling German measles Liberty measles? And wartime censorship of honest papers? Bad as Russia. Remember our kissing the feet of Billy Sunday, the $1 million evangelist, and of Amy McPherson, who swam from the Pacific Ocean clear into the Arizona desert and got away with it? Remember Voliva and Mother Eddy. Remember our Red Scares and our Catholic Scares, when all well-informed people knew that the OGPU were hiding out in Oskaloosa, and the Republicans campaigning against Al Smith told the Carolina Mountaineers that if Al won, the Pope would illegitimize their children. Remember Tom Heflin and Tom Dixon? Remember when the Hick legislators in certain states, in obedience to William Jennings Bryan, who learned his biology from his pious old grandmother, set up shop as scientific experts and made the whole world laugh itself sick by forbidding the teaching of evolution? Remember the Kentucky Night Riders? Remember how trainloads of people have gone to enjoy lynchings? Not happen here. Prohibition, shooting down people just because they might be transporting liquor. No, that couldn't happen in America. Why, where in all history has there ever been a people so ripe for a dictatorship as ours? We're ready to start on a children's crusade only of adults right now, and the Right Reverend Abbots Winthrop and Prang are all ready to lead it. Well, what if they are? Protested R.C. Crowley. It might not be so bad. I don't like all these irresponsible attacks on us bankers all the time. Of course, Senator Winthrop has to pretend publicly to bawl the banks out, but once he gets into power, he'll give the banks their proper influence in the administration and take our expert financial advice. Yes. Why are you so afraid of the word fascism, Doremus? Just a word, and might not be so bad with all the lazy bums we got panhandling relief nowadays, and living on my income tax and yours. Not so worse to have a real strong man like Hitler or Mussolini, like Napoleon or Bismarck in the good old days and have 'em really run the country, and make it efficient and prosperous again. In other words, have a good old doctor that won't take any back chat, but really boss the patient and make him get well whether he likes it or not. Yes, said Emil Staubmeier. Didn't Hitler save Germany from the Red Plague of Marxism? I got cousins there, I know. Said Doremus, as often Doremus did say it. Cure the evils of democracy by the evils of fascism, giving the patient malaria. But I've never ever heard of their curing malaria by giving the patient syphilis. Think that's nice language to use in the presence of the Reverend Falk, raged Tasbro. Mr. Falk piped up. I think it's quite nice language, and an interesting suggestion, Brother Jessup. Besides, says Tasbro, this chewing the rag is all nonsense anyway. As Crowley says, might be a good thing to have a strong man in the saddle, but it just can't happen here in America. And it seemed to Doremus that the softly moving lips of the Reverend Mr. Falk were framing, the hell it can't. End of chapter 2.